spot. Thank you very much. You know, I've cracked this joke many times at a Jewish function because you always can. But Woody Allen said he tried all his life to come late to a Jewish function, but he never succeeded. So that's one that we can tell almost at every Jewish function. I was thinking quite a bit about how I would present this topic tonight. And I thought that the best way that I could go about it would be to take three aspects of his legacy as I saw them, two in brief and one in detail, and speak about those aspects to try and just get a sense. I'm not a historian. I'm not somebody who is going to tell you his life story. More trying to get a narrative, if you like, a bit of a storyteller, just to see if we can get a flavour of what this man actually was all about and what he meant to the life of the Jewish people. So, you know, Rabin's life is the story of Israel. And I don't know anybody else about who that is said. And I think I saw it somewhere in the exhibition as well. Julian Lisa, when he was going to speak in Parliament, he asked me what could he say about Rabin. I said that's exactly what he could say. That's what he began his address in Parliament too, and he was kind enough to attribute it. So I'm not going to tell the whole story of Israel, but the question is, what is the story of Israel? And the next slide I use in one form or another in every single talk that I give virtually, and that is, what is Zionism? I mean, if Yitzchak Rabin's story is the story of Israel, and we all know there's a state over there called Israel, but what the hell is the purpose of that place? So this is supposed to be at least partially interactive, so if anybody has anything to contribute, shout it out. If you heard me say before, don't. But what is Zionism all about? What in its essence, what are we talking about? What is Rabin's legacy all about? Anyone? No? Okay, maybe we'll warm up later. I mean, essentially, if you boil it down to one sentence, it's about securing the Jewish people and determining the fate of the Jewish people. That is really what Zionism is about. It's very important to understand what we're on about, because if you don't know what we're on about, then you don't know how to go about it. And the story really is that after 2,000 years of powerlessness, after being a minority in every country in the world, sometimes very privileged, for instance, as in Australia, we still can't determine or secure the Jewish future. And it's important to understand that the Jewish state is the vehicle for fulfilling that mission. You know, the Jewish News earlier last year on Yom Ha'atzmaut, somebody wrote a beautiful piece about what's the purpose, and it was about, you know, the establishment of the Jewish state. Well, if that's all, yes, but if that's all it was, that finished, 70-something years ago. Job done, go home. It's not about that. It's about what that vehicle, what that state is going to do and its purpose. And every single question about population, about land size, about human rights, is all about what it takes for that vehicle to be able to carry out its function. And if you understand it in those terms, that the purpose of that vehicle is Jewish security, but determining the Jewish future, then you'll be able to understand not only Rabin, but really the political map in Israel. And so the question is how that vehicle should look, but that's not enough. And that's where Rabin came in. Not only how it should look, but how you're going to go about it. Many people can dream and many people can have a plan, but if you can't do anything about it, that's all it is. So the first area that I want to touch on is trust and integrity. So, you know those two characters, Peres and Rabin, in When Smoking Was Okay? They were great rivals. They weren't friends. They were great rivals and huge differences between them. The people didn't fully trust Shimon Peres, but they did Rabin. The people saw Shimon Peres as he was too smart, and he also thought he was too smart for the people. And he was a genius, but he was not one of them. He was more or less above the people, whereas Rabin was from the people. Now this is a really important thing that you need to understand in Israeli politics. You didn't serve in the army, you ain't going to be the Prime Minister. If you didn't do something serious in the army, you ain't going to be the Prime Minister. Whether that's right or wrong, it's not. Now, Shimon Peres didn't serve in the regular army. Now, that wasn't his fault. He was too smart. He did a lot of other things, secret things, but it wasn't seen. It's arguable whether he did more in a military sense for the State of Israel than Rabin. That's a debate that historians have, or not. But Rabin, he was not just a soldier, he ended up being the chief of staff. People identified with him. He lived his life more similar to the people. Peres could never win an election outright. There's a joke in Israel that if two people running for the next prime ministership are Shimon Peres and Shimon Peres can't win. But that's true. He never won an election. He became prime minister twice. Once by Rabin's assassination, he became acting prime minister, and once by rotation in a tie. But he was smart enough to understand that. I like to think, by the way, of their relationship sometimes like Keating and Hawke. Hawke was always played the larrikin, the man of, he was the Rhodes Scholar, but he didn't act like that. Keating, dressed in the suit and the tie, But Peres was smart enough to understand that if he wanted to get to power, the partnership had to be Rabin number one and Peres number two, and that was the ticket that took them eventually into government. So Rabin was the trusted role model, and both of their paths to government. So I think that one of the elements that he leaves behind, and I'm going to come to integrity in a sec, in that trust integrity being the one group, is you need to trust the leader. If you can't trust the leader, you're not going to follow him, you're not going to trust his motivations and so forth. And Rabin did exemplify that. And although the next story is a negative story, it's quite positive. The bank account scandal of 1977. Now, Rabin, he was the the ambassador to America. Obviously, when he was in America, he had to have a bank account. He had a bank account, which was in US dollars. When he came back to Israel, he forgot to close the accounts. So Leah Rabin was spotted by a journalist one day going to a bank when they were back in America on a visit, whilst he was the Prime Minister now. And it was illegal in Israel at the time to have a foreign dollar bank account, or to have a foreign currency bank account. And it was relatively small in terms of money, so supposedly 2 accounts. And it was Leah Rabin, it was clearly understood that she was the one who was using it for spending trips and things like that. But she wasn't popular, right? She wasn't a popular person. It would have been easy for Yitzchak Rabin to blame her, but he refused to do so. He took responsibility. He effectively resigned. It was the end of his first term as Prime Minister, and he paid the monetary fine. I think that's spelled paid wrong. He paid the monetary fine that went along with it, and as I ended his first term as Prime Minister. So it showed something about taking responsibility, owning up to what was, as I said, illegal at the time. And part of his legacy is that people today compare the current situation in Israel to the personal example of responsibility as shown by Rabin. In other words, nobody's measuring up to that example. And if you want to take difficult decisions and be a leader, so that, as I said, the people need to trust you, but the key is they need to believe that what you're doing is in the national interest and not for personal gain. And I think that that's a very important part of his legacy. So that's just the first thing I want to talk about, was trust and why in integrity. The second thing, I won't spend as much time on one aspect. We reached a point of incitement where, it's inconceivable, except it happened. It should be inconceivable, that Rabin, there were posters made of Rabin, his face superimposed on Nazi uniforms and so on and so forth, and we know what that led to, right? So I don't want to harp on the incitement that led to the assassination, but it's part of his legacy. And the amazing thing is, okay, does anybody know who that is? He's also up there. No? Nobody? Okay. I was told this is a really hot audience. That's Rabbi Yehuda Amital. Rabbi Yehuda Amital. Now, he would have sort of fit into the Jewish community in Sydney. He was from Transylvania, except he went on Aliyah. He was a Romanian, spoke Hungarian, went to live in Israel, joined the army, fought in the army, and he is the first settlement rabbi in the state of Israel. He's the settlement rabbi, right? This is a guy that straight after the Six-Day War, soon after the Six-Day War, went over the Green Line to a place called Gush Etzion, set up Yeshivat Har Etzion, if you follow the B'nai Akiva youth movement today, almost all of their graduates that go on Israel programs go to his yeshiva. I mean, he's no longer alive, but the yeshiva he founded. And Rabbi Yehuda Amital is the settlement rabbi. Now, who killed Yitzchak Rabin? Yigal Amir. But he came from where? He came from the group of people that this guy leads. Right? It wasn't this guy's philosophy, but he came from that group of people. And so, as I already said, who took over as Prime Minister after the assassination? Acting Prime Minister was Shimon Peres. Right? Now, Shimon Peres, what is the first act he does after the assassination? Yehuda Amital is not a politician, right? He's a settler rabbi. By the way, not only is he a settler rabbi, he's a nationalist who believed that if you're going to study in yeshiva, you also have to do army service. And he set up the whole movement called the Hesder units in the army. He's the founder of the Hesder movement. The Hesder is where you go to the army for longer, but you combine studying in the yeshiva with being in army service. And he's the founder of all of that. He's one of the most revered figures in Israel, in modern Orthodoxy. And Shimon Peres comes to him and says, Rabbi Amital, this is immediately after a modern Orthodox Jew, not a Haredi, a modern Orthodox Jew assassinates the Prime Minister, and he says, you must join the government, and you must become the Minister for Reconciliation. The Minister for healing the wound in this country. We said already before, I said already before, that Shimon Peres was a genius. He really understood a lot of things. So people found it inconceivable at one point in time, because the incitement was against Rabin, but after the assassination, there was a lot of pushback, a lot of incitement back the other way. So, saying Yigal Amir was typical of his group and so on and so forth, which he wasn't. So he came into the government just for a brief period, because the next Prime Minister was, anybody know? Who was the Prime Minister? Remember, Shimon Peres can't win an election, right? So after the assassination of Rabin, a few months later, in June, there's an election in Israel. Bibi Netanyahu facing Shimon Peres. By the way, Bibi Netanyahu also very, very poor electoral performer. Scrapes in every election. We went to bed thinking Shimon Peres had won the election. Then we remembered he was Shimon Peres and he couldn't win the election. And then the next morning we woke up and Bibi had won the election by less than 0.5% of the vote. Right? Sorry, I'm not attacking anybody. So by less than 0.5% of the vote. So in that intervening period, Hamas didn't help Peres by all the bus bombings and so forth. But Shimon Peres brought this guy into the government. So the important lesson here is how to have strong disagreement and ideological divide without questioning somebody's loyalty. You can be for Oslo or against Oslo. It doesn't mean one is for Israel and one is against Israel. And it's important to know how not to tar an entire group because of the actions of an individual. Because, as we know, the consequences are shocking. So the lesson learned, hopefully, from the incitement debate is not to cross certain lines when attempting to determine Israel's future. And I think this is another part of Rabin's legacy. But the main part I want to concentrate on, and I was wondering what to call this, whether I should put peace in inverted commas, end of conflict or anything, but it was easy to type peace, so I just wrote peace plans. Now, if you looked at the exhibition, or even if you haven't, you know who this guy is. Yigal Alon. Very good. There he is with Rabin. That's Yigal Alon, that's Rabin. There he is again. Anybody know which one is Rabin? That one's Rabin, and that's Yigal Alon, right in the middle. So why are we focusing on Yigal Alon? He's probably the most influential non-front person in the history of the State of Israel. Yigal Alon was Rabin's mentor. Now, Yigal Alon was the head of the Palmach, okay? And he's 2 years older than Rabin. Rabin fought under him in the Palmach. Yigal Alon held many positions in the government. Once he was acting prime minister. But he eventually became the foreign minister under Rabin. The roles had become reversed. Rabin was able to do something Yigal Alon was not able to do. And that is rise in politics and activate plans that mainly came from Yigal Alon. Now, Yigal Alon came from the leftist pro-Russian faction of the forerunner of the Labour Party. In fact, Ben Gurion, who I always argue is the most right-wing prime minister in the history of the State of Israel, he considered Alon and his party too leftist and dangerous to really participate in that, and he convinced Alon to leave his faction to come into the government. The reason I emphasise this, firstly, leftists and rightists has zero meaning, but we use those terms all the time. But the reason that I emphasise what a leftist communist he was, or came from, is because all of the peace plans that Israel more or less follows today are his plans. And basically, in many forms, but started off as the Alon plan. What month was the Six-Day War?
June.
Question I asked at Mariah, how long did the war last? You'll be surprised how many kids got that wrong. I saw it myself. Some wrote 3 days. It was interesting. How long did the Six-Day War last? 3 days. First presented to the cabinet a month after the Six-Day War. Now, this is the leftist part of the Labour Party, is presenting a plan of what to do in the expected event which came in August the 29th at Khartoum, where the Arab League said no, 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 no to recognition, no to peace, no to negotiations. That's the leftist plan for the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, or Yudav Shomron. And basically, or its basic principles are what are called defensible borders. The green line, are we familiar with where the green line is here? The green line is not a border. The green line was an armistice line that happened at the end of the First World War. At the end of the War of Independence. And the question was, when the Arabs will reject peace with us, what are we going to do with this territory? So Yigal Allon comes along and he draws these defensible borders. The green line were called the Auschwitz borders by Israel. Because, some of you travelled a lot further than the narrowest part of that line just to get here this evening. 9 miles, 15 kilometres is about, it doesn't take long to cross that and cut a country in half. So let's look at some of the features of this plan. Number one, to preserve the Jewish state. Remember, we're talking about the original mission, with a separation of populations. So basically, all of these areas, the green areas, would become not part of a Palestinian entity, but part of an Arab entity, that no Jews would live in those areas. They're the main Arab population centres. And the Jews would retain and annex all the blue areas. That's the sea, but all the other blue areas. Now, that's to separate the populations. If you want a Jewish state to determine the Jewish future, you have to have a Jewish majority. You can either do ethnic cleansing, which nobody wants to do, or give up territory. There's nothing in between those two alternatives. So it's important to understand that there's a difference between territory for territory's sake or territory for security's sake. If you're having territory for security's sake and you can gain greater security in your judgment by ceding territory, then you will give up territory. But if you're having territory for territory's sake, there's no point, nobody's going to cede any of that territory. So this is a plan based on security, territory for security. Protection of Jerusalem. Can we see where Jerusalem is? Now we know what happened in the War of Independence in Jerusalem, where the Jews were expelled from the old city, where they were taken to prison. We never got to go back to our holy sites. That wasn't going to happen again. So you see the blue all around Jerusalem? That's going to stay Jewish. Keep the Jordan Valley for security. Because of topography, there's a big difference in this area and this area. Keep the Jordan Valley. And the Arab areas at that time, the Allon plan was, God forbid, to have another Palestinian entity or anything like that there, but those areas were supposed to be annexed to Jordan. That was the vision. That's the Labour Party vision. Now, you also notice that the two green areas are completely separated, so you don't have territorial contiguity. And there are these two things here, which are called the Krish Alon, the Alon Road. And, back in the one to connect the Arab areas and one to connect the Jewish areas. And back in the day, when you went to Gush Etzion, you could actually see the remnants of the road. It's very hard to see it nowadays. So settlement building, and I did put settlement in inverted commas because Depends on your political viewpoint whether they are settlements or not. But from 1967 to 1977, for the first 10 years after the Six-Day War, it's a Labor government. They're the settlement builders, not the Likud. The Likud are the settlement taker-downers, but they don't build settlements. So, if you think about all the peace plans that are made by the Likud, giving up territory, Labor building territory, that's the updated Allon plan in 1970. And it's important to note a couple of things. For 10 years, the Labor Party built the major settlements according to the Allon plan. You see these white blocks, the black squares? I'm doing it from here. Anyway, they're the Jewish towns that the Labor Party built. All according to the Allon plan, which, by the way, was adopted by Rabin, and Rabin was able to implement, and it was Rabin who modified it, and we'll see that maybe a little bit later. So, Krish Allon, I spoke about the Allon Road. In 1975, Rabin was Prime Minister, and under him, the most controversial settlement was built. When I say controversial, it wasn't controversial in Israel, but controversial in the international arena, and that's Ma'ale Adumim. See that black dot there? That black dot there? Sorry for my hand. Anyway, you can see the black dot, right? Ma'ale Adumim. Ma'ale Adumim today is the largest non-Haredi settlement, or town, or city, in the West Bank, or Yudav Shomron, whatever you want to call it. It's about 40,000 or so people. The other two that are bigger are Haredi towns, Modi'in Illit and Beitar Illit. Haredim don't live there for political reasons, they live there for economic reasons. They're much closer to the Green Line, and they don't even really know where they're living, so in terms of the political map, so that doesn't concern them. But Ma'ale Adumim is to the east of Jerusalem. Gush Etzion, which I was referring to earlier, is to the south. That's where that Rabbi Amital was. That's Gush Etzion. Efrat, Rabbi Riskin, those sort of people, if that means anything to people here. But Ma'ale Adumim, it does something amazing. Ma'ale Adumim, firstly, it protects Jerusalem to the east, but Ma'ale Adumim ensures that you can't have territorial contiguity between those two blocks. Right? So that was set up in the time of Rabin in 1975. Now, Area E1, which is the one that rears its head sometimes in international fora, is the area between the black dot and Jerusalem. The area between the black dot, and Jerusalem. That area there is E1. And that's what every Israeli Prime Minister says they're going to build on, and no Israeli Prime Minister does, because of the international situation. But it was always envisaged by Rabin that that will eventually be built upon, and that will secure keeping the other side at a weaker position and to stop territorial contiguity. Now, Oslo didn't happen in a vacuum, 1993, and we all know the story about Peres and Balaam behind Rabin's back to a degree, and then he came to be a reluctant thing, but Rabin was ahead of the game. He detested the PLO, and he didn't trust them, and he refused to negotiate with them. He opposed the idea of a Palestinian state, up until his dying day. However, on the 31st of July of 1988, King Hussein changed the picture, because he gave up all semblance of control, or wanting control, the Arab entities in the West Bank. So in 1989, when he was defense minister, Rabin issued his initiative, his peace initiative. And that was that, okay, we couldn't talk to the Jordanians anymore, we were going to talk to the local Palestinian leadership. We're going to come to a deal with them, because the PLO didn't live in those areas, they'd fled the areas, right? So he tried to have a dialogue with them, but then he realised that they're weak, that they're not able to control what's going on, and reluctantly, that's how he came to negotiate with the PLO. So 3 weeks before his assassination, when he spoke in the Knesset, he described that future Palestinian entity as less than a state. It was very clear the whole time that, Israel couldn't tolerate, for security reasons, a PLO state. His preference was some sort of role eventually for Jordan again, but always for security control by Israel. So we jump forward 7 years from Oslo to Camp David. And, it's always our friends that get us to give up more than our enemies, because if it's a president of the United States we don't like, we just say no. If it's a president of America that we do like, we just say, thank you, and we take whatever they offer. And that's Bill Clinton. Now, in the middle of 2000, there was negotiation. Camp David had failed. Towards the end of the year, Clinton issued another map. He didn't check with the Israelis, he just issued this map. Ipso facto, the Israelis accepted it. And that's the map of the two-state solution at Camp David. And it's really important to understand what happened here. The white patches, right, are the patches that Israel would keep, and the rest will become a Palestinian state. You can see contiguous, Jordan Valley gone, but you can see that Clinton kept Ma'ale Adumim and E1, right? Clinton understood that. And the Israelis said yes, just to compare, that's the dream, right? That was what Clinton offered. Very big differences between those two maps, right? We're comfortable with that? So that's why in Israel, when the Palestinians walked away from it, when Arafat walked away from it, and then started the Second Intifada, and caused all of that terror and destruction, the Israelis, it changed Israel forever. So the rejection by the Palestinians of even the Clinton map, right, and the following Intifada, it changed the thinking which stands till today, last 20 years in Israel, that the shorthand is either there is no partner, or you can't trust the partner, or nobody really wants to share. If you don't want to share, what do they want? The whole thing. That's the thinking in Israel, right? So that shaped everything, and that stemmed from Rabin's brave attempt to put the Palestinians to the test. So they were put to the test and they were found wanting. I already said that. But it left a deep scar on Israeli society and a realization of the awful truth. That there wasn't going to be an agreement. It wasn't possible to have an agreement. And this too is Rabin's legacy. You know, if you don't try, he had the ability to try, you can't put that theory to the test. Ironically, 5 years later, another ex-Labour member, or Labour-inspired person, who was, of course, Ariel Sharon, changed later on in life to parties, repeated that attempt with the disengagement from Gaza, right? And he also took a calculated risk, and it also, both of those in Israel are perceived as having failed. Whether they did or didn't is a whole different ballgame, but they were perceived as having failed. And it led to what is described everywhere as a shift to the right in Israel, but of course that's not really true. The Israelis haven't given up the Elon plan, let's say. There's no shift to the right, there's a shift on timing. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So, you know, everyone likes to compare themselves to great people. I've got nothing I can compare myself to Rabin with, other than one thing: both of us didn't wear ties. So, I do own one tie though, so I don't know if he owned one tie. But and this is in the video, at his funeral, Clinton said this. It was very touching. I read that in 1949, after the War of Independence, Ben-Gurion sent him to represent Israel at the armistice talks in Rhodes. And he had never before worn a necktie, didn't know how to tie the knot, so the problem was solved by a friend who tied it for him before he left and showed him how to preserve the knot simply by loosening the tie and pulling it over his head. Says Clinton, well, the last time we were together, not 2 weeks ago, he showed up for a black tie event on time, but without a black tie. And so he borrowed a tie, and I was privileged to straighten it for him. It's a moment I will cherish as long as I live. So what's the peace connection to that? The peace connection to that is Rabin set a tone back in 1949 at Rhodes, one Arab country at a time. It's one of the most important things that he learned, and you can see how the Abraham Accords were progressed, one Arab country at a time. Let's see why. So there he is, actually wearing his borrowed tie, looking over the plans at Rhodes. Rabin was not a diplomat. By the way, that's another thing that endeared him to the people. But he learned a very big lesson at the armistice talks in Rhodes. And that was, basically, that if you negotiate with all of the Arab states together, you're not going to get anywhere, because the radical ones will embarrass the other ones, and you can't make a deal. You've got to deal with them one by one. It was a very important lesson in negotiations that he learnt there. He carried that through with his life, and, of course, made the peace deal with Jordan. But it carries on to the Abraham Accords. None of those peace deals with any of those countries are made with all the countries sitting in the room together at the same time, and certainly not with the rejection states around, because they would have been embarrassed, the UAE, Bahrain, and so on. So, now we jump to 2020, 20 years after Camp David, a different American president. You can say what you like about President Trump, and everybody says what they like about President Trump. Maybe, and I just posit this, he understood the Middle East better because he understood despotic dictators and how they thought. Aside from Israel, we're talking about the Arab countries in the Middle East. But he knew how to deal with the Arab world. There's no doubt about that. And he cut to the chase. So if you look at the Trump plan, it's actually the Rabin update of the Alon plan. It's still very much a two-state solution, in inverted commas, because it's not really a state two-entity solution. Now, this is the only thing that deviates from the Alon and Rabin plan. In the Trump plan, because there are demographic differences now, because originally Jews were not supposed to settle in those areas, right? In the green areas. But settlements grew in those areas under various prime ministers. And so under the Trump plan, nobody moved. So the Jews who were there, in the main 15 towns, could stay where they were, and they didn't have to move. But it's based on a separation of population. Now, the Alon plan had us keeping, or Israel keeping, approximately 30% of the area and 70% going to a Palestinian entity. The Trump plan has exactly that percentage, 30% staying with Israel and 70% going to a Palestinian entity. But Israel had to agree to give up the remaining 70%. And what's not well understood in the diaspora is that's why right-wingers in Israel didn't like Trump. He wasn't liked by the right wing. Because according to them, according to Trump's plan, they had to give up 70% of Yehuda v'Shomron. They didn't want to give up. It's a really big problem, but it's not perceived as such outside of Israel often. We had to agree to a Palestinian entity or state, and we retain the Jordan Valley, remember, for security. The Jordan Valley, on that side there. Okay? So we had a complicated plan of roads that would connect places and things like that. But basically, even till today, that was the updated version of the Rabin plan, without the problem being about retaining all the Jews and not moving those Jews that live inside Arab population centres. It's based, as everything in Israel, on demography, on having a Jewish majority, and on security, on securing that Jewish majority. They're the only two considerations. So, President Trump changed the narrative. Do the Palestinians want a deal or not? It wasn't a good deal for them, but they didn't come back and say we want a better deal. But the really big point was, why can't Arab countries look after their own interests without being hostage to Palestinian intransigence? Until Trump came along, no American president was going to support a deal that didn't first resolve the Palestinian issue. Trump broke that Gordian knot. And, as with Jerusalem as Israel's capital, President Biden supports the Abraham Accords. He supports Jerusalem being Israel's capital, but he never would have done it. So once it's done, he supports it. It's not a question. And it's not a question he's actually a friend of Israel's. But he wouldn't have done it. And that's the genius of Trump in the Middle East, if nowhere else, that he understood what was the blockage and he worked on that blockage. And that's why he's popular in Israel. Probably more popular in Israel than he was in America. So, a term came into being, and Yossi Escher will know this term, but if you want to know where anybody stands, and it was named after Rabin, the term was the Rabin Hawks. This became a descriptive term which still stands today. The Rabin Hawks were people who thought like Rabin. And who are the Rabin Hawks? Pretty much the bulk of the Israeli people. Tough on security, wanting a deal. Nothing's changed. Hawkish on security, but willing to take calculated risks, and Israel continues to take risks. If anybody will come forward and offer a deal, Israel will take another risk. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Combination of demography and security. Now, aim to secure the Jewish state and ensure her future. Today, for instance, Naftali Bennett, if we talk in modern terms, Gideon Saar, those two parties and their party leaders, they're not really Rabin Hawks in the pure sense, because for them, they also have ideological issues on territory, but they are both very pragmatic. It's very interesting when you actually read the headline and then read what they actually talk about. But today, the Rabin Hawks are people such as Yair Lapid and Avigdor Lieberman. They're the uber Rabin hawks today, except for one person. Who do you think's the real uber Rabin hawk today? Netanyahu, absolutely. Arush Shalom was also a Rabin hawk. You know, he built the settlements, so he felt he could take them down. Right? Gaza disengagement, so on. Okay. But the biggest Rabin hawk today is Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's just no doubt about it. This guy, he talks one way perhaps, but he acts in a particular direction. A lot of talk about annexation, much ado about nothing. No annexation. He could have annexed anything. Could have annexed Gush Etzion. Wouldn't have even been unpopular in Israel. There are certain areas that everybody in Israel agrees will belong to Israel forever. I'm not going to go into the history of Gush Etzion and why that area, but didn't do it. I call Bibi the Trump whisperer because he's whispering in Trump's ear, and Trump bought all of his arguments, which he carried on from Rabin, making deals with Arab countries one by one. That map that Trump presented is Bibi's map, because the difference between the Rabin and the Bibi map is only that you don't move the Jews that are inside the Arab population centers, because Bibi can't do that. That's his electorate. Those are his supporters. They don't know what they're supporting, but, you know, they think he's with them. I'm not so sure that he is. But he has to talk to his perceived electorate. And the current election revolves around the question, does Netanyahu act in the national or the personal interest? That's a qualitative judgment that voters will have to make. Is he like Rabin, or will he do whatever he needs to do from his personal interest, and the national interest will, you know, go into the background? Now, that's the question that this election hangs on, and I guess we'll see the results in the not-too-distant future. So the hand of Rabin is still today. I was going to say the ghost of Rabin, but then I thought that is a gruesome way to put it. So I just said the hand of Rabin. Peace and security policies, principles and priorities are the priorities and the principles he set. They haven't changed. As I said, the Abraham Accords, one by one, they're in his modus operandi. The type of leadership required to advance them. It will take a character of Rabin's stature to take Israel in whatever direction it goes. One of the problems we have with Bibi Netanyahu is that really people, his detractors, don't recognize that he is the only one in today's Israel that can actually also achieve something in these directions, because he has the stature and the charisma and the history to carry the whole population forward if he finds something to do. It finds a path that he wants. So all those people that are very happy to get rid of him have to understand that you're putting peace back many, many years, because there's not going to be a leader after him for quite a while that will have his authority. The taking of calculated gambles, so it's not just theory. It's one thing to talk about, we'll do this, we'll do that, but putting yourself on the line and the people of Israel on the line. But we need to do it. We need to do it to prove to ourselves where we stand, and we need to do it so the world can see that we're willing to take risks for peace. Rabin, now, Ali and myself had a little disagreement on this one, but Rabin is popularly portrayed as the warrior who turned peacemaker. And that doesn't do it for me. That doesn't mean it's not doing it for somebody else, but it doesn't do it for me. I prefer to see it in a different way. It wasn't that Rabin enjoyed fighting and therefore he said, let's go and have a fight. He was trying to achieve something. So, when he realized that it was not going to be achieved in war, and there was a chance of achieving it in peace, it was the same objective he was trying to achieve, just a different modality. So, in reality, he was just trying a different tactic to achieve the same strategic outcome. And the words tactic and strategy are extremely important because they mean completely different things. So Rabin rose above being merely a tactician to being a strategic vision. It's a very different thing. The guy who has the strategy, or the lady who has the strategy, is what do we want to do? The tactician is then how you get there. But it's the strategic vision that's of extreme importance. And Rabin never lost sight of his strategic vision. And today, we mourn his passing. I don't mean today, just today. I mean today in general. We mourn his passing, but we feel his presence in everything that takes place in Israel still today. Thank you. So, are there challenges or questions or contrary views? There's no right view. There's no correct view. It's all just people are interpreting everything, including myself, from their own prism. Not prison, from their own prism.
So where's the Palestinian state at the moment? What's the state of the Palestinian state?
They're the biggest losers. It's nowhere. It's nowhere. Until, at the moment, Mahmoud Abbas, who was elected, 15 years ago for a 4-year term or something, is talking about elections. Already now he's saying because of COVID we may have to put them off. A lot will depend on, will somebody come after him? I was asked this, Rob knows I was at a function last week or whatever, I was asked the same question. I've always thought that Marwan Barghouti, who sits in an Israeli prison, is the sort of, in a way, the Mandela of the Middle East. His reputation is being enhanced the whole time because he's a multiple murderer, he's a mass murderer and all of that, but he's not a fundamentalist. And Israel's already made many deals with him. It's also ridiculous, that we don't talk to Hamas. That's rubbish. We talk to Hamas every day because we have to live with each other. We have to make deals. We have to get things going. So Marwan Barghouti doesn't sit in a prison like a normal prisoner. He's a potential leader. He's a deal maker. And he's very popular with the street. Mahmoud Abbas is not popular with the street. Arafat, dead all these years, is still more popular with the Palestinian street than Mahmoud Abbas is. Alive, right? But Marwan Barghouti is very popular. So if there will be a Palestinian, the Palestinians are nowhere until such time as they themselves decide, I guess, if we take what you said earlier, the Rabin method. Not by war, but by negotiation. But the biggest losers are the Palestinians. And when they're losers, we're losers. Because that's in the same neighbourhood. It's hard to live in a neighbourhood where there's unrest next door.
Ron?
Yes.
What are the chances of Iran? They're obviously stirring the pot a lot. Where do they fit into it?
Iran are the patrons of the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Yeah, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, basically. Look, in this country, when we had the PPEs, the personal protective equipment coming in, who got them? The government, yeah? In Israel, who gets them? Who got them? The Mossad. It's a secret operation to get PPEs. Why? Where were we getting them from? Most of them from the UAE. This was before the official signing. So you can't officially sell, so you make Look, Iran, Obama and Trump were very similar in many ways. Before everybody shoots me, remember incitement, be careful. They were very similar in many ways because they both made America look weak in the Middle East. All right? Obama kept threatening, red lines. Yeah, red lines. No, nothing happened. Trump, what was his policy? America first. Allies have to look after themselves. We're not coming to help you. We don't want our soldiers there. It's in fact Biden, ironically, just this last few days, that took strong action in retaliation in the Middle East over what happened in Iraq. So an Israeli-owned ship was attacked. Now, it's not an Israeli flagged ship. It's not an Israeli ship. It happens to be an Israeli-owned ship that's leased out to somebody else. It was a calculated attack. Israel has retaliated by attacking Iranian targets in Syria. The Iranians are careful not to escalate it too much, but all of the, we are the victims of schisms in the Arab world that have nothing to do with us. There's two major schisms. One is what I call the Arab world, but Muslim countries are divided geographically into Arab and non-Arab. Turkey and Iran are not Arab countries. They're Muslim countries, but they're not Arab countries, right? That's one divide. And the Sunni-Shiite divide is the other divide. So the Arab Sunni countries, Jordan, Egypt, etc., UAE. Bahrain's interesting because the leadership is Sunni, the population is Shiite, but with 1.5 million people, you don't have a lot of population. So these divides, Iran and Turkey are fighting for domination over that whole area. Don't forget, the Ottomans ran it for 400 years. And the Arabs remember the Ottomans, they don't want them back. They also don't want the Iranians. So who's the big power in the Middle East today? in the Middle East? It's Israel. Israel's the big power. And Trump, you have to give him the credit for this, Israel paid no price for those peace deals. It was America that paid the price for those peace deals, particularly with Sudan and Morocco. Recognition in the case of Morocco of Western Sahara, and in Sudan in absolving all the terrorists of any responsibility and compensation. Many American citizens were very angry about that because they weren't going to have a chance of getting their terrorist compensation. So, the role that Iran plays is uniting the moderate Sunni Arab world with Israel. The problem that Israel is trying to negotiate with Biden is that which will of course surprise all of you, but Trump didn't particularly care about the human rights records of any countries in the Middle East. Biden does. And at the one hand, Biden is causing trouble for Saudi Arabia over human rights, and particularly over what's going on in Yemen. On the other hand, he's strongly backing them vis-a-vis Iran. So it's nothing that's that simple, but ultimately Iran is uniting the Sunni Arab world with Israel and seeing Israel as its basically the protector. And I'll just throw in one other thing there. Where it's controversial, in inverted commas, that the UAE is getting American F-35s. What do you want? You want Israel to go and send its F-35s to defend the UAE if it's attacked by Iran? Of course we want them to defend themselves. So although Netanyahu had to play the game at home of saying, well, it's not part of the deal or we're not that concerned, on the other hand, of course he was supporting that. You're going to send Jewish pilots to defend the UAE against Iran? Let the UAE defend itself against Iran or assist in the defense. So there's what's overtly there and then what's below the surface. But Iran, as a negative factor, is a positive factor in Israel's relations with the moderate Sunni world, moderate Arab Sunni world.
Well, who do you think will be next after Netanyahu?
Well, I wrote an opinion piece that in a drought, it's very clever, you can always predict it's going to rain, you just don't know when. And Netanyahu will one day not be the Prime Minister of Israel. I don't know when that'll be. He is the most clever politician in Israel. There are some people that consider that an insult. Some people consider that it's an art in itself. He's escaped many times. By the way, if something happens externally with Iran or something, it's only going to play in Netanyahu's hands. Because at the end of the day, he's the safe pair of hands. Another paradox is, what's been the quietest time in Israel's history? The time of Netanyahu. On average, Israel has lost 130 to 140 people per year from terrorism or war. In every year. On average. In the last 40 years. What's the average during Netanyahu's period? 12. People feel that it's quieter. People feel safer. Okay, not if you're in Sderot. I get it. But, where the bulk of the people live, yes. Of course, Netanyahu's problem is a different problem. The deaths from COVID, they're horrendous. If only Jews wouldn't have gone around saying we've got the cure, but get the cure first and then say we got the cure. Israel's natural advantage of independent thought, where every taxi driver thinks he has a PhD in immunology, and every street sweeper understands the biogenetic formulas. I mean, it's like crazy. Everybody's making their own decisions. So whilst Israel was the world leader in fighting COVID in the beginning, it's no longer the world leader in fighting COVID. So Netanyahu, very cleverly, it's an unbelievable strategic exchange. We can't beat COVID or fight COVID. We're going to defeat it. Israel's going to be the first country in the world that's fully vaccinated, become the guinea pigs for the world. That's what they are, with the Pfizer vaccine. That's why Pfizer agreed to give it to them quickly. By the way, also because they paid more, but that's a different story. And, 1 million unemployed. I mean, the story continues. But, I don't know what the latest number is, but 5,700 deaths so far from COVID is a horrendous number. It's more than twice the number of people killed during the Yom Kippur War. So that's one of the questions, the judgments that people will make. Either that they'll remember that, or they'll go ahead and say, well, he's the one who got us back to work, stopped the deaths, and so on and so forth. There are many people that can come after Netanyahu, many good people, The question is, if they'll be able to agree amongst themselves, which of them should lead? That's the real problem, and that's Netanyahu's luck. But the real election will begin after the election, because once we have the election, then all the argy-bargy will be going on as to who goes with who and who goes first and all of that. And remember also the President of Israel is sitting there, Ruby Rivlin, with a great power to choose who to appoint to give the first chance to form the Prime Ministership. And I'll give you an example of the Machiavellian nature of politics. Bibi, in one of the elections in the last 12 years, he didn't win them really easily at all, as I kept saying. But one election he was beaten by Tzipi Livni. President was Shimon Peres. Classical thought would say, what? Shimon Peres would offer Tzipi Livni to make the government. No? He didn't. He offered Bibi Netanyahu. Why?
He didn't really make it.
Sorry?
He didn't think he'd make it.
No, not at all. Because he understood very well that only Bibi Netanyahu could bring peace, could bring the plan that Shimon Peres wanted to enforce. Tzipi Livni couldn't because half the country would be against it. It's only the right-wingers that look like right-wingers that have ever given up anything. Begin, Sharon, really, in a irony, if you don't want to give up territory, you've got to vote left. But it's true in Australia as well. Work choices. Everybody remember work choices? If the Labor Party bring in work choices, who's going to object? The Liberals? Liberals bring it in, you're going to have half the country objecting. So, in a Machiavellian way, it's the same thing. But it explains why Shimon Peres understood the true nature of Bibi Netanyahu. But the reason I mentioned the president is because the president today is Ruby Rivlin. Ruby Rivlin is from the same party as Bibi Netanyahu, and they detest each other. And Ruby Rivlin also believes that Netanyahu isn't a Likudnik, because Ruby Rivlin's a Jabotinsky follower. He's just about the only one left in Israel when it comes to territory. He's a one-stater. Everybody lives in the one state. Everybody has a democratic right to vote. We take our chances. It's a pretty brave way to go about things, but that's the end of a Jewish state. But Bibi Netanyahu and Rivlin don't get on. So, if it's close enough, you never know who Rivlin might appoint. Gideon Sa'ar, who's running against Bibi, claims he's the real Likud. So he's got, Menachem Begin's son in his party, Benny Begin, on the Knesset list. Shamir's granddaughter on the list. We'll see.
Well,
Politics is a game.
Don't forget Gideon Sa'ar led Rivlin's campaign in the Knesset for presidency against Bibi.
Right, so Gideon Sa'ar is, let's go back to Rabin for a second. Gideon Sa'ar is seen in one way, in the integrity line, as more in the mold of Rabin. Because he says he's honest. That's not to say Bibi's not honest. He's honest. He does what he says, and he says what he does. You can like what he says, or you don't have to like what he says, but you know what he stands for. No Mickey Mouse changing what's going on. And Gideon Sa'ar, there was, in the last election, when people couldn't find a clear path to the prime ministership, there was even a suggestion going on, what Yossi said, that Rivlin will break even all tradition and go to somebody in a political party, not the head of the political party, but Gideon Sa'ar, and ask him to see if he can form a government. Now, it'll be easier for Rivlin because Gideon Sa'ar has his own party. It'll depend on the numbers, and you've got some parties like Gideon Sa'ar jockeying to say, I will never join Netanyahu as if he's going to be the prime minister, locking himself into a position. And you've got Naftali Bennett, who's a better politician in that sense, less straight in that sense, saying, I don't know yet, maybe I'll go with him, keeping his options open. But Gideon Sa'ar, if he would end up going into a coalition with Netanyahu, with Netanyahu's prime minister, I think that would irrevocably destroy his reputation, So the answer is, I don't know, but there's a number of people that could easily take over, and very capable people. I pointed out in a previous talk that this is the first election of the 4 in this series where every party is headed by a seasoned politician. And at the end of the day, you need politicians to run politics. Generals are finished, right? All the generals stepped back, whether it's Bughi Alon, whoever it is. They all stepped back. They didn't, Ashkenazi, all of them. They're not in this election. Gantz is still there, whether he passes the threshold or not is another question. But you're going to have seasoned politicians who understand the art of politics, at least negotiating for the next government. But at the end of the day, it's up to the people of Israel. If the people of Israel can never make a decisive choice, that's really the problem.
Ron, just one thing.
Yes.
I don't think, if I didn't miss it, Rabin was the first Israeli Prime Minister as a Sabra.
Yes.
And I think that was a very important factor of his popularity. Also, the differences between him and Peres. Peres was like the outsider, and he was like the real thing.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you. People get that?
No.
Rabin was born in Israel. Peres wasn't born in Israel. And so the thinking is different if you come from Europe or if you're already born in Israel. There's two different thinkings there. And it's a very important point. Thank you. Yes?
People who are out demonstrating against Netanyahu,
Yep.
are they demonstrating against his alliance with the religious and therefore disenfranchising them? What's the basis?
Look, the protesters against that, everything this election is about Netanyahu, as it has been for the last 3 elections. Except beforehand, the last 3 elections were about Netanyahu, the statesman, and the external relationship versus his internal character. Now it's all about the internals. So those people are protesting that a guy under indictment a person under indictment shouldn't continue as a prime minister. The problem is that in Israel, if you're not only the prime minister has some degree of immunity from prosecution or delay, right? Anybody else, a minister has to step aside, but a prime minister does not have to step aside. He's not breaking any laws by remaining as prime minister. So he needs to remain as prime minister for his own personal reasons, which was one of the things I raised before about national interest and personal interest. But the demonstrators are demonstrating against him, against his character, against his conduct, against what they say is a tarnishing of democracy and of the rule of law. So that's what they're demonstrating. They're not talking about a policy. They're not talking about a settlement. They're not talking about the Abraham Accords. It's all about him and what sort of person should lead the country. But, the demonstrators are out there demonstrating, but it doesn't translate into votes. At least so far, it hasn't translated into votes. So, in Israel, once somebody from here, an academic from here, wrote about a demonstration in Israel that they felt they had to join to protest something. And, it was like 20 people. And I thought that's just a queue of traffic lights in Israel. Demonstrations in Israel are hundreds of thousands of people. You're not talking about 30 people. It's not like Australia, So you have to also be careful how you read the newspapers to see what's being made to be a bigger deal than not. His personal troubles are certainly an issue. But, it hasn't been so far an issue enough to unseat him. Yeah.
Is this the closest election ever?
No.
No?
No. I told you about the election between Peres and Rabin. Peres and Netanyahu, 1996. Less than 0.5% of the vote between the two of them. No. Well, firstly, we don't know what this election will be. Look, opinion polls are notoriously inaccurate in Israel. In Israel they say, they do these world indexes. So Israel is always in the top 3 countries in the happiness index. People are happy. It's also in the top 3 countries in the complaints index. So it sort of means that Israelis are only happy when they're complaining. But, I caught a taxi the last time I was in Israel, which is November of whatever it was, 2019. This taxi driver was hucking me in, about this Bibi is bad, Bibi is this, a 20-minute taxi ride. As I got out of the taxi, I said to the taxi driver, who are you going to vote for? He said, Bibi. Israelis, are vocal about their... So opinion polls don't tell you anything in Israel. They're completely inaccurate. And, the general opinion polls are between 500 and 700 people. The country's now 9 million people. A lot will depend on turnout. A lot will depend on the Arab vote. A lot will, Bibi has successfully divided the Arab vote. Arab Israelis are concerned about crime, about COVID, a section of them for sure. Everybody's concerned about their own personal lives. This makes sense. You want to feed your kids, you want to live, you want to have good education, you want to clothe everybody. So I take that as positive signs rather than a negative sign. But the opinion polls are completely inaccurate. So we don't know what the number of seats will be and how they'll turn out. And only after we know that will the negotiations begin. Look, I must say, Ehud Barak has a joke that 1/3 of Israelis work, 1/3 of Israelis pay tax, and 1/3 of Israelis go to the army, and it's all the same 1/3. And it describes the question of the Haredim, of the ultra-Orthodox. Look, I have some sympathy for the ultra-Orthodox. They are struggling more than anybody else during this time. You cannot imagine the conditions that they live in, the bulk of them. Average family, 9 kids, 2 adults in a 2-bedroom apartment, but a 2-bedroom apartment that nobody here would call a 2-bedroom apartment, in a block that has, maybe 30 or 40 of such apartments in them. They need the school system open because that's where their kids, half their family sleep, half their family eat. They're losing, the leadership of the Haredim are losing their youth, which is a problem for them, because it's not China, Israel, right? You can't divorce half the population from the internet. So the Haredi kids have 2 phones. The phone they're allowed to have, which doesn't have the internet, and the internet phone, the smartphone. They know how to use it. They're walking in the street with with Yossi's kids. And they want to be like them. They want to have the things that they want. So nobody really wants him in the army as such. The idea is for them to do national service. The Israeli army used to be the finishing school. So give them an education, teach them how to be nurses, teach them how to be teachers, so they can go back to their communities. It's a very difficult problem, the Haredim. But it's politics. Listen, everybody likes to laugh at the Israeli political system. I think the Australian one is funnier. Craig Kelly, he's a party all of his own now, one person. I mean, it's nice, it's great. Anybody can get into parliament in this country and do that and whatever. But I mean, every political system has its drawbacks. Now, the Israeli political system doesn't have 2 houses. So whenever you really want to know what's going on with legislation, you've got to look at the Knesset readings. And I'll give you a good example. Did Bibi Netanyahu support the disengagement from Gaza or not? Well, he told his people he didn't. There were 4 votes. 3 times he voted in favour of the disengagement from Gaza. Where was he during the 4th vote? He didn't turn up to the vote. That way he could tell people, I didn't vote in favour of it. I wanted to vote against it. So you have to look at what people actually do, right? Rhetoric is very important to listen to, but in Israel it's more important to see what people actually do. So I think I'll just maybe finish off with a personal anecdote. I like to have my photos taken with the Israeli prime ministers. They don't like to have their photo taken with me. But in 1997, in Bibi's first term, I was in his office and I asked for a photo. And we were standing there, the photographer was there, and he had a cigar in his hand. This is in 1997. If we're going to talk about all of the things that have happened since. He said, oh, hang on, can't have the photo until I put the cigar down. I don't smoke, I don't drink, but I didn't know what was the significance of putting the cigar down. And he said to me, oh, it's a Cuban. I said, oh, that's wonderful. But I looked at the cigar, there's no markings on this cigar, right? I said, well, firstly, what's the problem with a Cuban? He said, well, America has an embargo on Cuba, number one, and they're very expensive cigarettes, And I said, well, but nobody will know. He said, everybody knows I wouldn't smoke anything else. Thank you.